In early September, Napoleon's forces defeats the Russian army at the Battle of Borodino and secures his advance towards Moscow, which he enters a week later. He was welcomed by a post-apocalyptic city, ravaged by fire on the command of Moscow's governor, and he instantly knew that his stay there wouldn't be long, so he sought peace negotiations with the Tsar, which were rejected. The first snowflakes fell and the temperature was freezing. In addition, with some battles lost on the front, Napoleon finally withdrew and the downfall was coming. The army still numbered 108,000 men, but his cavalry had been nearly destroyed. With horses exhausted or dead, commanders redirected cavalrymen into infantry units, leaving French forces helpless against Cossack fighters, intensifying the guerrilla warfare. With little direction or supplies, Napoleon followed the old Kaluga road southwards towards unspoilt, richer parts of Russia to use other roads for retreat westwards to Smolensk, than the one being scorched by his own army. For the march eastwards, Napoleon's goal was to get around Kutuzov, but he was stopped at Maloyaroslavets on his way to Medin in the west. At the Battle of Maloyaroslavets, Kutuzov was able to force the French army into using the same Smolensk road on which they had earlier moved east, the corridor of which had been stripped of food by both armies. This is often presented as an example of scorched earth tactics. Continuing to block the southern flank to prevent the French from returning by a different route, Kutuzov employed partisan tactics to repeatedly strike at the French train where it was weakest. As the retreating French train broke up and became separated, Cossack bands and light Russian cavalry assaulted isolated French units. Supplying the army in full became an impossibility because of the continuous forests. The lack of grass and feed weakened the remaining horses, almost all of which died or were killed for food by starving soldiers. Without horses, the French cavalry ceased to exist. Cavalrymen had to march on foot. Lack of horses meant many cannons and wagons had to be abandoned. The loss of thousands of wagons and trained horses weakened Napoleon's armies for the remainder of his wars. Starvation and disease took their toll, and desertion soared. Many of the deserters were taken prisoner or killed by Russian peasants. In early November 1812, when Napoleon arrived at Dorogobush, Napoleon learned that General Claude de Marle had attempted a coup d'état in France. Badly weakened by these circumstances, the French military position collapsed. Further, defeats were inflicted on elements of the Grander Army at Vyazma, Polotsk and Krasny. Russian armies captured the French supply depots at Polotsk, Vitebsk and Minsk, inflicting a logistical disaster on Napoleon's fast collapsing Russian operation. However, the union with Victor, Oudinot and Dombrovsky at the Boba brought the numerical strength of the Grander Army back up to some 49,000 French combatants as well as about 40,000 stragglers. All the French corps went on to Berezina, where a strategic bridge to cross the Berezina was destroyed by the Russian army. The crossing of the river Berezina was a final French calamity. Two Russian armies inflicted heavy casualties on the remnants of the Grander Army. Because of an incursion of Thor, the ice on the Berezina River started to melt during the last major battle of the campaign. In military terms, the escape can be considered as French tactical victory. It was a missed opportunity for the Russians, who blamed Pavel Chichagov. As Napoleon's army reached Boba, 50 kilometers from Berezina, he was informed that the bridge over the Berezina at Berezina had been destroyed. Fortunately for the Grander Army, Napoleon also learned that a French cavalry brigade had discovered a place where the river might be crossed 8 miles north. Although this was a place where an ice crossing could normally be made in November, a temporary thaw of the ice and the muddy banks made it necessary that bridges be constructed. Plans were made to build pontoon bridges. Fortunately, the commander of the pontoon bridge builders, General Jean-Baptiste Biel, had disobeyed Napoleon's previous orders given during the withdrawal to destroy the equipment, forges, and tools necessary for building bridges. To draw the Russians' attention away from the vicinity of the crossing, numerous diversions were undertaken. On November 25th, bridge construction started in Studienka, even though numerous campfires belonging to the forces of Admiral Chichagov were observed across the river at Brily. The movements of French General Nicolas Adinot's corps and numerous rumors led the Russians to believe that Napoleon would either attack at Berezina and attempt to repair the bridge, or he would lead his troops south of Berezina and cross the Berezina downstream. As a result, Chichagov made the decision to move the main body of his force south of Berezina to Shabashtseviki so that he could watch and patrol a 90-kilometer stretch of the Berezina River. Russian General Chaplets and his force of approximately 3,000 men camped at Brilly were ordered to move. As a result, on the morning of 26 November, the French discovered that the Russians had abandoned their camp on the west bank. 40 French cavalry troopers made their way across the river and protected the crossing of 400 men in boats. This small force then secured the west bank. Meanwhile, neither of the Russian forces pursuing Napoleon from the rear were very aggressive, and both remained substantial distances north and west of the Berezina River while the French bridged the river. This river was 20 to 30 meters wide and filled with drifting ice, but its banks are swampy. By 1 p.m., the smaller of the two bridges was complete, and Adinot began to lead his infantry of 7,000 men across the river and establish a defensive position to protect against the Russian forces to the south. Later that afternoon, the larger of the two bridges for the artillery was completed. Overnight on 26 to 27 November, Russian General Chaplets became aware of the French crossing, consolidated his forces, and attempted to return to Brilly to intercept the French. Chaplets' forces, however, were stopped well to the south of Brilly by Adinot's battalions. Also on the 27th November, Chichagov began to move the main portion of his army back to Berezina when it became apparent that there was no French activity downstream. Chichagov, however, chose not to immediately move north to Brilly, inasmuch as his men were still in transit and not fully assembled. By midday of the 27th November, Napoleon and his Imperial Guard were across. One of the spans broke in the late afternoon, but the engineers had it repaired by early evening. The corps of Marshal Davout and Prince Eugene were able to cross before the day ended. The last unit on the eastern bank, Marshal Victor's 9 Corps, was given the order to defend against the approach of Wittgenstein, who had then reached Berezina. As a part of that operation, French General Louis Parthenot's 12th Division of the 9 Corps suffered a great defeat, surrendering over 8,000 men when they were overwhelmed by Wittgenstein at Staroye Berezina. On 28 November, the Russians coordinated their efforts and attacked Napoleon's grander army on both sides of the river. On the west bank, Chaplets reinforced with additional infantry attacked the French forward positions and began to push Adinot back to Brilly. French General Ney took command when Adinot was wounded and the Russian advance was stopped. 25,000 men engaged in a firefight that lasted into the night. Finally, French General Dumac led a cavalry charge of the cuirassiers, forcing the Russians back and ending the battle for the day. On the east bank of the river, Wittgenstein attacked Victor's 9 Corps at 5 am. The French were pushed back in fighting that went on for 8 hours. At 1 p.m., the Russians attained a position that enabled them to flank the French and rain down cannon fire on the bridges. The artillery bombardment fell largely upon the stragglers, causing a human stampede as individuals rushed for the bridges or jumped into the cold river in an attempt to swim to the other side. The fighting and bombardment lasted for approximately 4 hours, at which time the bridge engineers began working to clear a path for Victor's 9 Corps to cross the river. At about 10 p.m. that evening, Victor's 9 Corps made their crossing and 3 hours later the bridges were free of Napoleon's armed troops. The bridges were then available for the stragglers. However, despite encouragement, most of those who had fought so hard to get across the river during the bombardment chose to light their campfires and spend the night on the east bank. The next morning, the commander of the engineers, General Ebel, had Napoleon's order to burn the bridges at 7 am. Ebel delayed the execution of that order until 8:30 am, at which time tens of thousands of stragglers and civilian companions were left behind. Following the campaign, a saying arose that General Winter defeated Napoleon, alluding to the Russian winter. Maynard's map shows that the opposite is true, as the French losses were highest in the summer and autumn. Due to inadequate preparation of logistics resulting in insufficient supplies, while many troops were also killed by disease. Thus, the outcome of the campaign was decided long before the cold weather became a factor. When winter arrived in November, the army was still equipped with summer clothing and did not have the means to protect themselves from the cold or snow. It had also failed to forge cork shoes for the horses to enable them to traverse roads that had become iced over. The most devastating effect of the cold weather upon Napoleon's forces occurred during their retreat. Starvation and gangrene coupled with hypothermia led to the loss of tens of thousands of men. Heavy loot was thrown away. Much of the artillery was left behind. In his memoir, Napoleon's close advisor, Armand de Caulaincourt, recounted scenes of massive loss and offered a vivid description of mass death through hypothermia. The cold was so intense that bivouacking was no longer supportable. Bad luck to those who fell asleep by a campfire. Furthermore, disorganization was perceptibly gaining ground in the guard. One constantly found men who, overcome by the cold, had been forced to drop out and had fallen to the ground, too weak or too numb to stand. Ought one to help them along, which practically meant carrying them. They begged one to let them alone. There were bivouacs all along the road, ought one to take them to a campfire. Once these poor wretches fell asleep, they were dead. If they resisted the craving for sleep, another passerby would help them along a little farther, thus prolonging their agony for a short while, but not saving them, for in this condition the drowsiness engendered by cold is irresistibly strong, sleep comes inevitably, and sleep is to die. I tried in vain to save a number of these unfortunates. The only words they uttered were to beg me, for the love of God, to go away and let them sleep. To hear them, one would have thought sleep was their salvation. Unhappily, it was a poor wretch's last wish, but at least he ceased to suffer without pain or agony. Gratitude, and even a smile, was imprinted on his discolored lips. What I have related about the effects of extreme cold, and of this kind of death by freezing, is based on what I saw happen to thousands of individuals. The road was covered with their corpses. This befell a grander army that was ill-equipped for cold weather. The French deficiencies in equipment caused by the assumption that their campaign would be concluded before the cold weather set in were a large factor in the number of casualties they suffered. From the Berezina, the retreat was nothing but utter flight. The preservation of war materiel and military positions was no longer considered. When the nighttime temperature dropped to -35°C, it proved catastrophic for Loysen's untried soldiers. Within 3 days, his division of 15,000 soldiers lost 12,000 men without a battle. More than 600,000 French men went in Russia, the biggest army seen then. Only about 50,000 returned. This defeat was humiliating. After the invasion ended, the Russians occupied Poland, and the War of the Sixth Coalition would start that would send Napoleon off of his throne right to Elba in exile.